listening to the Futures Podcast with me, Luke Robert Mason. On this episode, I speak to Professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, Jack Qiu.
iSlavery is more about workers and consumers losing their autonomy, losing their freedom. They become enslaved in different ways. One looks more pleasant than the other, but at the end, it's about reducing our options, reducing our freedom.
Jack shared his insights into iSlavery, exploring the ways factory workers are oppressed, how notorious corporations build systems of exploitation, and sharing what activists are doing to fight back. This episode was recorded on location in London, England, where Jack was promoting his new book, Goodbye, iSlave. Jack, your work is on iSlavery. Could you explain what iSlavery is?
iSlavery, from the word iPhone, iPad, so the I came from all kinds of ways to call today's smartphone or digital media. But at the same time, I also stands for individualism. Okay, so individual consumerism, that's how I imagine it. And slavery, of course, is about enslavement, about extreme ways of exploitation. This is an attempt to have a comparison, but also bring together historical lessons from slavery and anti-slavery movement to today's digital media and efforts to improve the world of digital media today. But as a more analytical concept, there is the manufacturing slave, people who are enslaved because they do production. So this is sometimes I call iSlavery along the assembly line. So especially Chinese workers who make not only our iPhones, but also Samsungs, any kind of digital gadgets today. So this is called manufacturing iSlave. And a second mode is called manufactured iSlave. So these are people who spend lots of time. So this is the consumption mode. Scholars like Terranova call them free labor, people who are addicted to digital media usage. So in cities like London or Hong Kong, so we have lots of people who lost their personal freedom because of too much addiction to digital device. So it's essentially, this also is the equally important part. Slavery works in the consumption mode, in the data mine, as much as in the assembly line.
So you're both an academic and an activist. How do those two things work together?
Well, I was trained actually of a traditional type of social scientist, which should not have too much overlap with activism. Although when I think back, actually this is, when I was a PhD student, I'm still very grateful I had the opportunity to work with Manuel Castells, very established social theorist. And he used to tell me that no matter how good is your social science research, it will not help with your activism because it's political decision, political will. So the two things are separate. But then I was also, when I was a PhD student, I spent 6 years in Los Angeles. I was with a group called Metamorphosis. We went into ethnic minority communities and to observe, to study, but also to help ethnic minorities from African American to Armenian, from Korean to Chinese, Mexican, and Central American community also improved. Back then was mostly radio, print media, church-based communication. So I think I also had some influence from there. But the real change that I started calling myself a scholar slash activist was 2009. That was the year when I did lots of hospital visits. In Shenzhen, the industrial area next to Hong Kong, which is probably the center of electronic hardware today. Now people refer to Shenzhen as the Silicon Valley of hardware. But back then, 2009 was still not called the Silicon Valley of hardware yet, but it was already having lots of work injuries. Every year, 40,000 fingers are cut or crushed or smashed when they produce goods for the world. Every other Saturday, I would be in the hospital. I would visit these injured workers. Most of them lost their fingers. So that's the time I realized the world of digital media is too problematic. It's such a problem that we only look at these things and try to understand them, not to change it. So iSlavery is one of the terms I picked up from activist campaign and then further develop it from the luxury of university environment, referring back to history, to global development, but then contribute back to the activist community as a scholarly input that hopefully will be helpful in unforeseen ways.
Well, it's not just your scholarly input. You've had direct run-ins with Foxconn, the company that makes these digital devices. Could you explain some of those run-ins that you've had?
Yes, in 2009, when I went to the hospital, these are typically 4 or 5-story buildings. Half of that building would be called hand injury or bone injury section. This hand surgery or bone surgery are almost exclusively workers who lost their fingers. And if you talk to those workers, the Foxconn was the number one place where they got injured, maybe 1/3, okay, because there are many other factories. Foxconn was by far the largest. Okay, which also they produce more injury because of the sheer number of their workforce. 2009 I was doing this along with one NGO, one labor NGO. The name was Tiny Grass. Tiny Grass people took me into this hospital, and then I was helping them out. So that was I was really just shocked. One challenge, if you study social problem, okay, is where can you find working class people who have time to talk to you? If you are working class, then you are very busy making ends meet. And then you don't have luxury to sit down, to talk to someone. But then hospital is actually a place where, you have lots of, time to kill, okay, and you are very lonely. Okay, many of these are young kids who are afraid to tell their family that they lost their fingers. Right, because their family would be heartbroken. So most of them are very lonely, and so that's how I started. But then in 2010 was the Daily Mail. Okay, invented the term Foxconn Suicide Express. Within 5 months, there are 15, 16 Foxconn workers committed suicide. I was in Taiwan as a visiting professor at the time, but then my colleague Pun Nai started 20 university activists. Okay, all of them are scholar activists. 20 universities from Hong Kong, mainland China, and Taiwan. So I joined that network when I was in Taiwan. And so I went to, it happens to be the annual press conference, the most important news event for Foxconn. Foxconn's main headquarters was in Taipei. Okay, and I happened to be in Taipei during that period. So I joined Taiwanese activists, and many of them are like me, okay, are activist scholars. And so we demonstrate in front of Foxconn headquarters, and I even collected poetry because when the suicide happened, many worker poets in mainland China would write poetry. So we gathered 20 poems from mainland China, and we had a public reading of those poetry while they have their stockholder event inside the main headquarters. So those were the things we were doing. I think indeed, this book, iSlavery, has a lot to do with Foxconn, okay, because the term, like I said, iSlave was the campaign name. Okay, it was just called the iSlave campaign after the Suicide Express in 2010, and it built on this 20 university network. And then SACOM was the Hong Kong-based labor NGO. SACOM stands for Students and Scholars Against Corporate Misbehavior. SACOM was a central node for this 20 university network. SACOM basically published things into English, okay, but most of the research for Foxconn was around that time. So I've been working on Foxconn since then. Okay, every year I would take students to the Foxconn neighborhood and monitor Foxconn, of course, through news, through other means. And now we are having, after I published this book, SACOM actually invited me to be on their board.
From a methodological perspective, how do you work with your students to study the work of Foxconn? Do they see you as a threat, or do they just allow you to do your academic research and they don't see it as a threat to their bottom line as a business?
They definitely see me and our network as a threat. Before 2010, before Foxconn, SACOM already worked on Disney. already worked on other major multinational corporations, and they were allowed to go into the factory to investigate, to do work from inside that factory as well. So in 2010, we actually met a representative of Foxconn. Okay, we said, we want to go inside your factory. They were kind enough to meet us, but then they never allow us or any other independent to go inside. So still now, Foxconn is guarded by high secrecy. Not just a researcher, but even the official union cannot go in their factory as they like. So Foxconn still is treated as a very secret organization. So we tried, to go inside overtly, but without success. We did not have permission from the company to go inside. So what we did for several years was to send student volunteers. We, of course, will have to train them before. So that we have students going inside Foxconn covertly. Undercover.
As workers?
Yes, as workers.
How do you as a university sign off the fact that you're going to send undergraduates or postgraduate students to go and work in a...
Not undergrad. Most of them are postgrads, yeah.
Right, okay.
But actually in East Asia, if you know the history of labor movements in South Korea and in Hong Kong as well, South Korea was on a much larger scale. Okay, there was a whole generation of student activists who go embedded on the floor, shop floor. Some of them even died, in that process. So the university, of course, cannot sign, as a formal, I don't know whether it's called IRB. In the US, it's impossible. But even in the US, I know, for example, Harvard Business School, they would send their Harvard Business School student to some assembly line to experience assembly line work. So that's possible in the business school, to train better business managers, for the supply chain. So they have to understand how things work. So that was possible.
So for the students who want to go and work at Foxconn, what does that training look like before they make that decision to become an embedded researcher?
So this is something we did between 2010 and 2014, actually. We did 5 consecutive labor studies summer school. It's 1 month long, and we admit students who have to persuade us that they are interested in labor studies, and they already have done something as students, association, or they've already reading and maybe practicing, by themselves in different parts of China, and then we would have them together for 1 month. We will start from reading Marx, but also, talking about what are the things to do, not to do, all right, and how to blend in workers.
So what are some of those things that you train them to do and not to do, and how do they blend in? How do they learn to blend in?
Well, one thing, for example, I would tell them as basic things as how you dress. What do you wear? Worker would usually wear darker clothes and no high heels. It's as basic as that. More important is also about how to take notes. When students start, they like to have their notepad, is completely off limits. If you go in there, the best way is to make full use of your mobile phone. You're undercover. And of course, we will teach them about ethics. This is very essential. So we go undercover not just to find a scoop so that we can become famous reporter. We go there for the only single reason is because there's something of major public interest. We need to know what's going on and what's going wrong along the assembly line. And that's something all the world should know the reality. We are there to find out what's the reality. And without going undercover, there's no other alternative. We already tried other options. And actually, Foxconn was opened for only 1 single day in June, if I can remember it right, in June 2010 to the media. All the other times, even now, Foxconn is still guarded by high secrecy. So we are there to find out what's going on. So to talk to workers, and usually this won't be too long. Also, we do not send students into the factory as individuals. We send them into the factory in small groups. I sometimes went undercover, but I'm too old because the workers are all in their late teens or early 20s. So I would be hang out in the neighborhood. So another very important thing to understand this monstro factory, Foxconn, the highest point according to Wall Street Journal, is 1.4 million people. right? Just one, the all the employee it has. And the largest campus is the way they call their factory facility. It's called Longhua. And that area has 400,000 people, just one factory facility. So half of the worker would live inside the dormitories, but the other 200,000 people live outside. So there's no problem for me to sit in we call it 大排档, okay? It's like street food in a hawker center, okay? I just sit there and then worker can talk to me. So some of my interview were done here because guards came to me, and talked to me, right? And so we can sit outside. We do survey outside. And sometimes they think I'm so old, look older. So they think I came from a special monitor service, okay? Very high level maybe I came from Taipei to monitor what's going on. So not only do workers fill in our questionnaire, they even wrote on the back of the questionnaire a little essay about how things should be improved, in this factory, because very seldom do Foxconn collect worker voices. So yes, so we use multiple methods when it suits the context. I have personally interviewed low-level managers as well. But then for the high-level management, okay, we collect all their press release, how Foxconn had a major argument with the official union in Beijing, all right? And we collect all those things, and then we piece things together.
So once you've identified the issue and you realize that it's a systemic issue, what are some of the solutions? So how do you enable workers to also be activists? What sorts of solutions do you suggest?
I think there are several answers. Okay, first thing is the quote-unquote ordinary workers do not want to be activists.
Is there a reason why?
One thing is there are workers trying to have their ends meet. Okay, or they're very young, they go to Foxconn, they came from rural China to see the world. Maybe to use a slightly jargon language, okay, this is a typical neoliberal subject. When they came to Foxconn, they already had the mindset to strive for individual success, to try to get more material wealth, and then try to become another consumer, successful consumer. You are what you buy, like what they have been seeing on TV. Most of these workers, when they grew up, they've never seen labor movement, okay, activists on TV. Or, they don't have activists around themselves, many of them. So that's the quote-unquote normal worker. But like any normally functioning capitalist society in Hong Kong or in London, okay, most people are not activists. They're part of the system. But it's not uncommon, okay, when they have a breakdown, like work injury could be one case, a vocational disease, or in other cases, people who cannot have wages, paid. Okay, they are subject to the most blatant form of wage theft. So they become activists, because they have no other choice. Around 2009 was also the time of global financial crisis. So about 30 million people, migrant workers, lost their jobs. So now they have the luxury of additional time to think about changing the system. Why they have worked so hard, but they still cannot climb up the ladder, okay, of social mobility promised to them. Okay, so that's when the neoliberal subjectivity started to break down. My attempt to write this book is one of many other attempts to provide workers with these tools. But then it's really up to the worker herself or himself to decide whether they want to use these tools. This is a lesson we learned from Leninism, is that you imposed on other people what they should think about. All they believe in the past is false consciousness, believe in me. But then in that sense, you lost the sense of popular democracy. I'm a socialist in that sense, being a socialist without being authoritarian. So there are lots of creativity. Once workers realize the problem is the system is going wrong, and then they have been creative in their own way. Like just now I mentioned, they wrote poetry. Who in the world still write poetry today? But when Foxconn workers were committing suicide, all the poets came from factory zones in different parts of China, or they were domestic helper. Okay, or they were construction worker, or they were dock workers. So they write poetry. And then these became new resources, cultural resources for labor activism. Oftentimes, they write better poems than me. Okay, even though I teach in the Chinese universities. So my role is not just there to enable workers, but also enable myself as a better listener, as a better observer, so that we can learn from existing worker activism, as limited as they are, but then magnify what successful worker bloggers have been doing. For example, I have organized physical meeting for worker bloggers so that they can exchange their best practices.
So the onus shouldn't just be on the workers, though, should it? It should also be on the consumers. And I know you quite openly say that you were one of those consumers at one point waiting for the next iDevice, whether it was the iPad or the new iPhone. And I just wondered, what is it that makes us so complacent as a consumer about this form of modern slavery?
I think this goes back to the same neoliberal subject. This is part of the neoliberalism, is liberalism, but on the surface. Liberalism should be about giving people more choice, more freedom. But then neoliberalism is actually you only have more choices in the department store, in the iShop. You only have more choices in the predefined way. And those predefined way are by the resourceful and the powerful. And usually these two come together as the elite decision makers. The consumerism is quintessential part, probably even closer to the audience of this program. We are programmed to think about, the next device as being cool. At the same time, most people would think of the previous iDevice is uncool. But when you think about the new cool, this is the theme of built-in obsolescence. When we lost our, freedom because our mindset is being programmed at the political economy level. The consumerist neoliberal subject also gets into the mind of Chinese workers as well. Now I go to factory zone compared to 7 years ago. Very few people would be able to afford for authentic iPhones, but now increasing them are using authentic phones. They are in the same kind of system. Sometimes when you talk to workers, they even glorify the myth of the next iPhone even more than average urban consumers.
Do you tell a story in the book of someone selling their organs for the next iDevice?
Yes, that's a very pathetic and saddening story. It's actually a 13-year-old or maybe 15-year-old. So he's a teenager. He was still in secondary school, and his parents, both of them are textile workers in the second-tier city in China. And then he sold his kidney to buy an iPhone and iPad. I think it was 2011. In the process, he used social media. He used QQ. This is the Chinese equivalent of Facebook. He used that to find out the person who wanted to buy his kidney. And then he was promised that it will just be, like taking one of your hair, and you will have no problem, no medical complication afterwards. But actually he lost, his ability because the condition of the transplantation. So yes, so that's a very sad story. So I think in China, probably other societies of the global south, in India, Latin America, Philippines, I wouldn't be surprised that some working class, especially young people, would be even more captured, more addicted to these digital media, to these latest gadgets, even more fanatic than what we would see around us, the iPhone fans in London or in Hong Kong. There's even more scarcity. The neoliberal subjective works by creating false markets, and then people would perceive, even though it could be produced in much larger quantity, but then it's perceived as being very scarce. That's where the social status of consumption, especially when it's not need-based consumption. This is to show off. So that came out even stronger in places like working class societies, working class China. Maybe this still works in working class UK, I'm not sure.
So you've tried to capture all of these different forms of iSlavery under this catch-all term, Epcon. Could you explain Epcon?
I developed this work bilingually. It started as a Chinese term to put Apple and Foxconn together. When it started, the Chinese term was called 苹果康. So it's more like Applecon. Appleconn. So it's Apple and Foxconn together. But later on, when I was writing this in English, if we look inside Samsung, Okay, or Xiaomi. Xiaomi is the Chinese brand mobile phone, smartphone, much cheaper, but the business model, the way they produce these phones is also in Foxconn. Samsung has its own assembly line, okay, not in Foxconn. But if you look at Samsung's problems of worker suicide, of vocational disease, is almost exactly the same. So in English, I simplified Applecom into Epcon, APPCONN, as a way to talk about all this app economy, okay, smartphone. So it has to do with the high-end design, the research and development in the Silicon Valley, in the case of Apple or even Google, I would say, okay, or Samsung or Xiaomi. They work actually hand in hand. Without Foxconn or similar assembly line, there wouldn't be so many devices. There wouldn't be so many crazy fans. Epcon is basically my way to call the structural forces that creates iSlavery. iSlavery is more about workers and consumers losing their autonomy, losing their freedom. They become enslaved in different ways. One looks more pleasant than the other, but at the end, it's about reducing our options, reducing our freedom. Epcon is the structural forces, works at the global level. Right, from the Silicon Valley to Shenzhen, from South Korea to different parts of the Samsung empire. Okay, there's actually a South Korean documentary called Empire of Shame, talking about vocational disease. Okay, so this is a global multinational. Epcon is also closely tied to financial capitalism. So that's the root of neoliberal capitalism, right? So it's financialization and all this. Why nobody is asking why we have to have a new generation of smartphone every year. It's because of the annual cycle, short-term cycle of the financial market. Basically, Epcon is the world system of gadgets, but the gadgets not only as hardware, but also as software, as PR industry, as ways of cultivating this
desire for these devices.
Exactly. So the not need-based, but want-based desire.
To a degree, some of these devices are then being used, and social media is then being used as a form of resistance. In a kind of weird irony, I know that you've looked at people who are using social media as a form of activism to reveal what's going on to the rest of the world. I wonder if you could speak to some of those examples.
Oh, there are lots of examples. First is because actually we had debates among our activists or scholars or students, whether we want to boycott all this and just stay with our old Nokias, right? But then that's a dead end, at least among my colleagues and friends and comrades. So we need to use this digital media to talk to the consumers, to the workers. The workers are smartphone users themselves. So there are many global campaigns, okay, including iSlave. That campaign actually used the same color of the book. These are the original Apple iPod colors, the famous advertisements, okay, with the music lover, okay, freedom. But then, so they use the same color. So this is what we call memes. It's actually a collaboration between SACOM and NGO, including Greenpeace and also Bread for All, okay, in Switzerland, right? So it's global campaign. And at the work, among workers, okay, so we have poetry, I already mentioned that. Okay, there's still a thriving poetry tradition, which we do not see in other upper class, middle class populations in China. They write poetry about their work, and then the poetry would become multimodal. Okay, so if it's a really good poetry, chances are there's another worker band. Okay, I work with worker musicians. They would make melody. Okay, they would transform the poem into a song, and then there will be live performance. They use those songs in their people's theater, worker theater performance. So they string them together into an hour long or 90 minutes theatrical performance. So there are all kinds of creative practices, and oftentimes these are by the more artistic individuals and groups. Another important instance is when there are major confrontations. Like I said, ordinarily workers workers would be too busy. But sometimes, okay, we see that when there's a recession, like the global financial crisis, we see that usually when right before a factory go public, before their IPO, the initial public offering, the company would be downsizing. They would be doing all kinds of cost cutting. And then that's the moment when workers start to realize they have to have a protest strike. And sometimes they would use the most creative forms of insurgency. And my favorite example is from 2009. This was a shoe factory. It's called 360 Degree. It's a Chinese brand making athletic footwear and apparels. So when 360 Degree was preparing for its IPO in New York, it was the financial crisis, and then the company tried to become even more lean and mean. So there were thousands of workers. This was in the province called Fujian, in a small town called Jinjiang. But then half of the town was working for this factory. So the workers started a strike. And what factory did was they bought off local officials and then used riot police and thugs to crack down on workers. Very bloody crackdown outside of the media attention. There was also local media censorship. So most people did not know it until things went dramatic. Probably my most favorite example about using digital media to have an insurgency by workers is that the shoe factory workers formed solidarity with hackers. Okay, we know China also has a sizable working class software programmer. They're not all in India. In China, we have a small army of software programmers who I call them gray collar workers. Right, so these are people who do tedious coding, programming, but making very low salary. And then they were probably my suspicion. Okay, I haven't really been able, because the place is rather far away from Hong Kong, so I've never done interview. But this is what my suspicion is that the shoe factory workers maybe have cousins or brothers and with the software programmers. So what they did is they came together, and what they did is they used a skill called search engine optimization. What they did is basically they hacked Google. So when anyone searched 360 degree using Google, they could not find the financial PR release from the company. What they find is thousands of pictures about bloody crackdown. So this was, by my account, is probably the first factory worker and hacker alliance. And then they had an ambush. This is probably the first cyber ambush against capitalism in the history of global labor movement. So it happened in a special time, of 2009, and it shows the creativity of 21st century labor activism in China and in the world. There are probably similar things in India, in Latin America that I haven't heard, but this is one thing that came to our attention, that as scholars and as activists, there are so many new things because the neoliberal capitalism, including the digital media reincarnation of capitalism, are endlessly novel in the way they exploit people. But at the same time, this is my lesson, okay, I learned from history and from my own activist work, is that the ways workers resist capitalism is also infinitely creative, using this form of hacking, for example, right, as one of many ways to use digital media against the digital capitalism, against slavery.
Now, you said that it was 1.4 million workers are employed in these factories. What happens if automation solves the iSlavery problem, but also makes the need for these workers obsolete? What's going to happen in that scenario?
Well, I know in the West, for example, my best friend, one of my best friends, Adam Greenfield, wrote about automation, and he's very genuinely worried about that. I actually have a slight disagreement. I had talked to him about this already, but then, at least in case of the Chinese capitalism, okay, labor-intensive and also highly flexible capitalism. Okay, automation works more like a threat that never really materialized. For example, in 2010, when I was protesting outside Foxconn headquarters, we could not go inside. We were outside demonstrating. The meeting of the stockholders, an annual conference, was on the third floor of that building. But then on the first floor of that building, there was already a fully automated lab. There was all robots making electronics. And Terry Kuo, the owner of Foxconn, actually bragged about it. Okay, we can already do without workers. So Foxconn has the most advanced robotics. I am trained social science in the old way. I only try to look at the past and present and make sense of them. I don't want to predict in the future. But at least so far, if you look at the actual number of workers that Foxconn have employed in China and their robotic technology, Foxconn robotic has been becoming more and more advanced. But at the same time, they have been hiring more and more Chinese workers. Like I mentioned, at the high point, this was 3.3 years ago, Foxconn had 1.4 million. That's the last time I had, a Wall Street Journal reported on the total number of workers Foxconn have in China. But then in 2010, when the Suicide Express happened, Foxconn had less than 1 million people. So while Foxconn have been making more advanced robotics, industrial robotics, it has not hired less workers. It has increased its number of workers. The answer, actually, if we know how Foxconn's exploitation works, it's actually rather easy to explain. Because workers can be laid off, workers can be subject to wage theft, but robotics cannot. You cannot lay off industrial robots, because to maintain a robot, you have to have the electricity, you have to have, the technicians, okay? And if you don't have that robot will stop working. So you cannot reduce the cost. So robot is actually a fixed asset, okay, in terms of the mode of production. But human workers are flexible. And you can have them earning small amount of money, and then they buy the things you sell them, and then the money come back to you. So far, I would be probably sounding maybe too dismissive to people who worry a lot about automation. But so far, robotics and the threat of robots works more like another way to discipline workers, to say if you don't work hard enough, if you don't accept the horrible conditions, then we'll have robots do your job. So far, that's what I have been observing, and in the Chinese context.
To some degree, it's the fact that the capital outlay to actually replace the workers with robotics is so high that they'd see a short-term return on that investment. And that wouldn't make the shareholders happy in the short term. It might preserve their business for the long term, but it won't mean that they're making the same sorts of dividends that they did last year.
You're spot on. Right. So it's the logic of financial capitalism to make short term. Because robots is a long term investment. Actually, even before Foxconn, I have an older book called Working Class Network Society, 2009, MIT Press, where I talk about the case of BYD. Today, BYD in China is a company, known for its electric cars, almost like the Chinese version of Tesla. But 10 years ago, BYD was the world's largest mobile phone battery producer. Right? And if you look at how BYD succeeded, before BYD started to enter the market for mobile phone battery, it was 2002, 2003. Before that point, 90% of the world's mobile phone batteries were made by two highly automated Japanese companies. One is Sanyang, the other is Sharp. And Sanyang and Sharp were already using industrial robots. And then they would make all the batteries for Motorola and Nokia. And they've been occupying 90% of the global market. Within 2 or 3 years, BYD got half of the world market share. What they did is they used human labor and in a very flexible way. And what also happened was because the cycle, so this goes back to the built-in obsolescence. The cycle of mobile phone is becoming shorter and shorter. Motorola and Nokia actually designed their devices to be durable. Adam Greenfield told me, at Nokia, they used to put mobile phone into washing machines to try to make it work longer. The battery also is actually a crucial part of our mobile phone that needs to be updated. Once you update your screen, your software. So the battery design used to be because the cycle for pre-smartphone mobile phones were longer duration. So it actually make more sense for batteries. Once you have you have your robots. Okay, the robots can work for, let's say, 18 or even 2 years, 18 months or 2 years. All right, and then you don't have to retool your robotic. They can make the same battery, okay, for 2 years, and then your investment come back. But then with the shift into a smartphone, okay, not only is there a new model of smartphone, usually not just for Samsung, iPhone, or all the Chinese brands as well. Okay, not only you have a new smartphone with larger, okay, screen, higher demand on battery, but even, for example, for your iPhone 7, the iPhone 7 in the first 3 months is the production process for making the iPhone 7 may be different from the next 3 months because they already have big data, okay, to calculate how iPhone has been working, what has to be changed. Sometimes it was changed in the wrong way. That's how Samsung got bust, okay, a few months ago, right? So the manufacture procedure become much more flexible. And when they design it, they never think about the worker side. So if you have to retool your robots every 3 months, it does not make economic sense. Okay, so but human beings, okay, it's actually
are easier to reprogram.
Exactly. So I call them programmable labor. Right, in that sense, that works much better for the financial capitalism.
So
logic.
General purpose machines, we've already got them. They're called humans, and they're easier to retrain every 3 months and build a brand new robot for a very specific, specialized task. I very quickly want to talk about this. You mentioned it at the beginning. This second form of iSlavery, the iSlavery that every single person who uses a social media platform is under, the ability for these platforms to actually generate wealth from our free labor, from our likes and from our engagement and from our clicks and from our shares. To what degree can something be done to make people aware that they are the product of those platforms?
One thing in Western society, as much as Hong Kong, okay, is the notion of privacy. Okay, this is an easy way to start to raise awareness about how the platform owners are exploiting us. But that's, like I said, it's an easy and common way to start, but that should not be the end. The solution, because the discussion, as much as I understand about privacy, is still very much individualistic notion. So there will be other alternative. One thing I've been spending more time on these days, okay, is called platform cooperativism. Okay, so this is as collectives, people come together and own their apps together, okay, and have developed their governance structure among themselves, negotiate. So in Hong Kong, we have many interesting examples, giving free rides to other people. Right, and so basically, it's Uber without being owned by a private, okay, corporation. But then these are people who help each other. Usually, they live in the same community. Okay, the community is called Taipo, and next to my university campus, and they have developed their own app. Right, and then in addition to giving each other rides, they also have their weekend yoga classes together, free, yoga sessions. So
you exchange a ride for a yoga session. Right. So it is truly the sharing economy,
exactly,
without the exchange of capital.
The genuine sharing economy. Yeah, and another of my favorite example is a senior care in Hong Kong. Even though Hong Kong is advanced capitalist society in many ways, but in terms of maximum work hours, okay, Hong Kong is very backward. Probably the only post-industrial society without legal limits. So in Hong Kong, McDonald's can ask their workers to work 20 hours a day if the worker is willing. Of course, they're very poorly paid. People want to do more overtime work. So it ends up, if the parents work for McDonald's, okay, working class jobs in Hong Kong, they won't be able to take the grandparents, okay, to hospital. So this was a group started as a single mother, and they initially was just a hotline with Excel so that they can help each other, because some of them are laid off, then they can help their neighbors to take the senior, okay, citizen to hospital. But now they have their own app, okay, it's called Around Neighborhood. It's this kind of grassroots practices. It will be giving us a fuller awareness, and also it's not just awareness, it's actually workable solutions beyond the platforms. So they oftentimes they started in Facebook, but then they ended up having their own apps beyond. They still use Facebook, but they are not constrained by Facebook.
So ultimately, this could potentially be at least one of the solutions to engineer sustainable change.
Definitely, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to Jack for sharing his thoughts on some of the ways we can work to overcome the injustice and oppression that exists within our global economic system. You can find out more by purchasing Jack's book, Goodbye, iSlave, A Manifesto for Digital Abolition. Proceeds from this book go directly towards a Congolese NGO set up to help improve the working conditions for miners extracting coltan, the mineral used in many of our digital devices. If you like what you've heard, then you can subscribe for our latest episode. Or follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at Futures Podcast. More episodes, transcripts, and show notes can be found at futurespodcast.net. Thank you for listening to the Futures Podcast.